Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining this TechLearnTalk today. It's great to see you here. My name is Johanna, and I'm from the UN Innovation Network. I've lost track a little bit of how many of these TechLearnTalks we have run over the years, but I believe this is our 12th webinar, and we've been running them since 2020 in collaboration with our friends from the ITU. And in these TechLearnTalks, you will see on the next slide that we try to give you a jargon-free introduction to new technologies. We want to explain in very simple terms how technology works, what it can be used for, and specifically show you the context of the in which context in the UN's work it can be used. We have in the past looked at technologies like AI, VR, we have done 3D printing, we have looked at drones, we have looked at robotic process automation, one of my favorite ones. Most recent one we did was on the metaverse. So a really wide range of technologies that we have tried to bring to you in very layman's terms. And what's been really incredible for me over the past years is the kind of experience that we have available in the UN system, and to see what colleagues are actually experimenting with and taking to scale. So it's not just the private sectors doing cool stuff, it's definitely the UN as well. Today we will be talking, as you will have seen from the invite, about open source. I'm sure you've all heard a lot about it and maybe know a bit about it. And today we're going to go back to square one to make sure that we all understand what it actually means and when we should use it and when maybe we shouldn't use it. And just a quick public service announcement. This is a webinar in a mini-series on open source. And those of you who would like to dive deeper can join for a session next week on digital public goods and AI democratization. That session is run in collaboration with the UN digital community, the DPGI, the Digital Public Goods Alliance, and the GIZ on September the 11th. We'll put the link to register to that in the chat just now. And yeah, so if we tickle your interest, please come back next week. And with that, I'm very happy to introduce you to our co-host today, standing in for my usual partner in crime, Ursula Winhoven. She's not available today, so very happy to have Mario Castrogrande, Senior External UN Affairs Officer at the ITU, joining us to host this webinar with me. Mario, it's great to see you. Over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Joanna, for that introduction. And before introducing our guest speakers, just to remind our audience today about the format of these webinars. First of all, it is being recorded and will be made publicly available. Also, after each presentation, we will have a Q&A session of no more than 10 minutes. So just a reminder for you to use the Q&A function so that you can already start putting your questions in there. You can also raise your hand after the presentation to read out your question. We will also invite you, if you're already using an open source, to share your experience, information, and links in the chat box. So without further ado, I am pleased to introduce our first speaker. His name is Vipul Siddharth, open source specialist at UNICEF, who will give us a non-technical introduction to open source and some examples of how it has been used in the UN system. Vipul, over to you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me well?
Yes, very well. Thank you.
Perfect. So let's start understanding what is open source. I have 15 minutes to explain you the basics and foundation of what open source is. And my goal is for us to understand the ethos that open source carry. Let me start with just a bigger picture of what is open source. Open source is a method. It's a method to develop and distribute software. It's set of best practices to make software and build teams that make software. It's also a movement. It's movement based on ideals and philosophies that goes beyond code. It's rooted in belief that software has an impact greater than any one of us, and certain freedoms should be protected. And when from the movement, when a collection of people's values and ideas come together, they take form of community. And that can be a project community, or that can be a community of ideals. And that's what makes it a culture. Open source in ethos goes beyond software. We just happen to talk about software because of the topic. When Volvo didn't patent their seatbelt design, it allowed a lot of other car manufacturers to use it, and today it saves lives every day. When Tesla didn't patent its battery design, it started a new generation of EV movement, and now there are a lot of better technology built from that, but it inspired many. So open source is a culture that goes beyond code. But when specifically talking about software, because open source in the end, it's two words, open and source. These are two English words. Source is your recipe, the ingredients, how to do something to your cake. That's the source code, how a solution is made. And open is the definition of how you share and distribute that source code. So open source, on screen, you have the definition defined by Open Source Initiative, which is the organization custodian of the definition of what it means to be open source. I want to point out all the components listed here. There are some who may use the word open source in relation to one or more of these, but a project is not really open source unless it has all the four freedoms that it should provide. And those are freedom to read how the solution is built, freedom to run it in any way you see fit, freedom to revise, to make any changes that fits your need, and then freedom to redistribute the solution with your friends or generally on internet. Without these four freedoms, a solution cannot be open source. Now, this is a simple definition. As you can see, this is the definition version 1.9. If you go on the link that is shared in the slide, you will read 10 points very elaborately explain what exactly is open source. Another term that you may have heard in the wild is FOSS, which stands for Free and Open Source Solution. Without getting into the intricacies of what exactly is the difference between free software and open source software, it's mostly the different sort of movements and foundations of how these solutions are built. And free and open source solution, or the software in general, is an umbrella term that covers both of these. And when we hear free, I want to highlight, it's a very common phrase in this community or ecosystem. Free as in freedom of speech. We are talking about liberty, not free as in free pizza or free beer, which is about money. So we are talking about freedom. A quick show of hand. I'm not sure if I can see the hands, but how many of you recognize all the logos in here? Or at least half of it. My main reason for this slide is to highlight that open source is everywhere. It's in your pocket, it's in your room, it's in your toaster to refrigerator. I'll explain how. It's also empowering the internet. As you can see on your screen, you have Google, you have Drupal, you have OpenStreetMaps, which a lot of us might know in the development context, and then also like Firefox, Android, in fact, a lot of open source use cases within UN. We may use some of these in our day-to-day life, but also certain platforms like WordPress that we depend for our services on that are powered by open source. Some of the examples of differences between an open source and proprietary solution, just for an example, would be Google Maps versus OpenStreetMaps, Chrome or Firefox web browser. At the same time, ChatGPT is a proprietary solution, but Mistral is an AI model which is distributed under open source license. So this is about general tools that we use and how we may depend on them. But when it comes to empowering the internet, Linux, which is a free and open source operating system, in 2014, a study found 79.3% of all public servers ran Linux, which means that every time you go to internet, chances of you using or hitting open source solution is quite high. 10 years later, as of August 2022, that number is almost unchanged. In fact, a bit increased, 80.6% according to W3 Tech surveys. And various other technologies and platform, how we develop our solutions, as you can see a bunch of list on the side, they are open source as well. The chances that if the solution is built, it has touched open source is incredibly high. Going on the similar route of empowering the internet, web servers are software that respond to, when you type a website, unicef.org, the server decides what exactly to serve based on that request. Those are called web servers. According to a survey by Netcraft, which surveyed over 1 billion web pages, top 5 in top few most used web servers are open source. According to the table that you see on your screen, Nginx and Apache, which are both open source server, they have alone around 45% of market share. OpenRusty, the fourth option, which is also a derivative or distribution of Nginx, again open source, adds another 8%. Very easy to understand that the impact value of open source is in trillions of dollars. In fact, a study by Harvard Business Review earlier this year published, they mentioned that the total value of open source accounts to $8.8 trillion. And if open source solution didn't exist, every solution would be 3.5 to 4.5 times more expensive to build. I often get asked about scale of solutions that we build. We want to deploy it in many different countries. How does that play in role? In humanitarian context, in the development setting that we work in, this is again one of the talks I was talking about open source, and someone said, what about scale? I just picked a random generative AI of the day and I asked, what are the top 10 or some of the biggest humanitarian software that we use nowadays? It gave me a list of 10, as you can see. Some of you may even know this. Ushahadi, Rapid SMS, Kobo Toolbox, DHIS2, and how many of them are open source? All of them. Open source is the successful strategy when it comes to making solutions that reaches the unreachables. But beyond empowering the internet and development context, it's also been playing a very important role in government settings. According to Federal Report of 2023 of US government, this is just a snippet out of that. Open source software plays a vital and ubiquitous role across the federal government and critical infrastructure. Now, this is just coming from US government. A couple of weeks ago, Germany released their second law on digital, it's something called Digital Law of Consumption. I'm not sure of the name exactly. They prioritizes, again, open source in all public procurement process. Switzerland released around 3 to 4 weeks ago, and the list goes very long. There are many different countries now adopting open source strategies and how it fits into their whole ecosystem. But why are these companies and governments moving to open source? With open source solution, you can choose to adopt and deploy the solution. It allows you full control and ownership over critical digital infrastructure and data. Because of the boundaryless nature of it, it reduces reliance on a foreign company or nations. Anyone can take it, rechange it, fit it to their own context, and have control on how it's being used. And because they are often built on open standard, which means standards well defined on how things should work, these enable customization to meet specific national need and regulations. And of course, because of the transparency that we may often relate open source with, you have insight into how the system works and how it handles sensitive data. Another one is leveraging collective intelligence for greater return on investment. Just I want to highlight a few studies done again. World Bank's GeoNode project received an estimated $2 million in external contribution on a $1 million investment. That's the return of investment directly into a project. European Commission did a study in 2021 where they found in 2021, they were investing 1 billion euros in open source business, and the total return on investment to European Union's economy was 65 to 95 billion euros. And that the same study estimated that there's 1 to 4 cost to benefit ratio in open source. That's a very compelling argument on why we should be investing in open source. But beyond that, return just doesn't come in dollar. It also helps in social uplifting and education, because development and change happens in public, learning happens in public. The third benefit, why a lot of companies and governments are turning, is access to cutting edge developments and talent. Using open source, developing open source allows easy adoption to latest algorithm and tools without reinventing them. That's the whole idea behind them. Innovation on top of each other. And it often accelerates innovation in areas like AI, which is a new thing that we are seeing a lot. AI is not new, but nowadays there's a lot of work around AI. In fact, we have many webinars in UNIN around AI. Open source also fosters a community that enhances software understanding and adoptions across industry. And because all the work done by a developer is in public, they are more excited to work, and you have more chances to retain better developers than if it was proprietary work, because all the great works that they're doing can be accessed by everyone, and they have a vetted history of what they have worked on. A very relevant benefit for us, if we are doing open source, is to avoid vendor lock-in and ensuring long-term sustainability. Open source provides flexibility to switch providers and bring development in-house when the vendor changes priority or the vendor doesn't exist anymore. It reduces the risk of being held hostage to a vendor pricing and policy change. And because if things are open source, a lot of people can read it and can further help in development later on. It ensures long-term access and control over critical systems and data. It also allows for modification and extension of functionality as the needs evolve. And the last, that there is a webinar next week for digital public goods. Open source is foundation of digital public good, as you'll learn. It also helps us build digital public infrastructure. It creates a common of public code that benefits society as a whole. It promotes innovation through open collaboration. And it fosters local tech ecosystem and job creation. But there are some important considerations when you do open source. And I would also like to talk about certain fear, uncertainty, and doubt around open source. Given the small amount of time, I'll try to keep it brief. When you are starting to do open source, there are three ways you can go. Either you are thinking of adopting an open source solution, or you are thinking of contributing to an already existing open source solution. Or the third route is producing a new solution that does not exist out there and you want to make it open source. Some of the financial understanding or considerations you need to have is often when you are adopting a solutions, the chances of reduced licensing cost is high. In fact, the same European Commission study found that there's a significant cost saving in terms of ownership of open source solution. There is potential saving on development through community contribution, but it's very important to understand that increasing or making or building a community around a solution takes resources itself. You do not have people randomly looking at the solutions and trying to contribute, but to have a community around the solutions, you need to focus on community guidelines, contribution guidelines, outreach, so people can look at your solutions and relate to. So you need to have a shared vision and alignment with the community, and all of those take resources. There's also a very valid point that initial investment can sometimes be used because vendors may not be comfortable working on open source solutions. And that can be for either reason. They may not be interested in it because they lose control over the source code they're developing. Even if they transfer the copyright to you, if no one understands, they have the ultimate control over it. Or they just don't know how to work in open source ecosystem. For that, you need to invest resources for internal training and understanding of what does it take to develop open source solution. And that initial investment can result in long-term sustainability of the solution. Even when the local team or country office or general organization changes priority, that solution outlives you. And if required, other countries who may have similar requirement can take it, adopt it, and continue to maintain the solution. And a lot of the time, I have seen these questions. The challenge around open source also slightly legal one. Because there are many different licenses on how you distribute your solution, license adoption and compliance can be a tricky one. You need to know how you're going to engage with your partners, how your solution is being used. Open source license can decide how scalable and how adoptable that solution is. There's also, you need to understand how are you managing internal contributions? How is the IP rights of incoming code being managed? For that, there are different strategies, different licensing handles it differently. There needs to be understanding of license compliance around open source. In the end, I want to leave you with this slide. Every day we are looking more and more digital world or more countries adopting this digital infrastructure. From payment infrastructure to identity solutions, banking solutions, all are becoming more digital. And the people who had no access to digital earlier are in the process of getting it or are getting it every day. Recently, we saw a CrowdStrike, Microsoft Windows CrowdStrike problem, and a lot of planes were halted, banking system was not working. That gave us a glimpse into how critical component digital infrastructure is becoming. I've heard a lot of my colleagues say that digital infrastructure is now critical human infrastructure. Given the nature of it, if digital infrastructure is critical human infrastructure, open source is the part that's been empowering it. On the screen that you see is the building block of many different solutions we take for granted. There would be no generative AI if it was not for scikit-learn and machine learning and many different Python and R of programming languages, which are open source that you can use to learn and build on top of. No student in university would have access to programming languages and text editors and databases to experiment, learn, and try with, to build, innovate on top of it, to make a solution that we take today for granted. With that, thank you so much. If there are any questions, happy to answer now.
Thank you so much, Vipul. Great introduction to open source. I am learning a lot through these TechLearn talks. I hope colleagues are too. So as Mario mentioned earlier on, we're very happy to take your questions at this stage on any clarifications linked to open source before we dive a little bit deeper without getting too technical. we invite you to put them on the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and you all can also upvote questions that you find interesting. Vipul, I think we have the skeptics coming in to start with. So there's a bunch of questions, and yeah, I know you're going to win them over. So the questions from two people on the security when it comes to open source. So are there any security or privacy concerns when it comes to using it? How can we justify open source in terms of security? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, perfectly. So the foundational thing to understand is software can be buggy. It's not just to do with open source solution or proprietary solution. Right? When you develop something open source, because to the nature you are going to keep it open, publicly accessible, you tend to develop with better practices. I have seen vendors who develop proprietary solutions where no one is going to look at it except themselves, probably. So they do often bad practices and often take very shortcuts. Developing open source incentivizes you to develop with better standards. And something to understand, the data that you collect and store and all the instances, individual instances of your solution is not what open source is. It's the source code that's public, not your deployment or the data you collect and how it mixes with that. So security and privacy concerns are very reasonable because it's public, but as many people have so far been saying it, security by obscurity doesn't work. When you keep something public, more people can trust it and it's auditable, more people can raise a bug request. Linux is far more secure than Windows for servers. That's why the reason of large adoption. There's also, which is a rare case, but I also want to highlight this thing we call Linus's law. Given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. When there are many people looking at the solutions, even small problems are fleshed out easily. Of course, the caveat to that is you need to have a community around it. But that comes with the open source. If you're trying to build a large-scale solution, it always pays off in long run.
A very solid answer, and I hope we have convinced those who are skeptical. I have two questions here that link to skills needed, and then Jose, I'm going to come and give you the floor afterwards, but I'll take an anonymous one first here. And the colleague is saying, I like the idea of not being dependent on proprietary solutions. How specialized are the skills needed to use or tailor open source solutions to the UN context? And if I may add, what do you think is the state of open source expertise in the UN system based on your experiences so far?
Yes, in the end, open source software, I'm talking about specifically, you need to have a development team if you're adopting it. If you remember, I said free in terms of freedom of speech, not free beer or free pizza. Another thing that I like to say is free as free puppy, which means you are going to adopt it, but it takes some cost to continue to maintain it. Right? There are different ways. Yeah, there are different ways of adopting or procuring. You don't procure open source solution, you adopt it. One way is to find a company that does services around it. And for that, it could be WordPress, one example, or Drupal itself. And there are companies that are built around Drupal who provide that for you. At the same time, like any other solutions that you would be developing, you need to have specialized understanding of it if you're going to adopt and host it yourself. If you want to run a disaster management solution, someone understanding the tech stack that it built on is really helpful for you to use it. It may be easier to start with just because that solution is already developed and often there is good documentation on how to deploy it. So you can start with it, but it's always good to have that skill internally if you are self-hosting it, because without it, you'll run into problems. Another thing I would like to highlight with open source, there are a lot of communities around, especially for the larger scaled solutions. And there is often a user helping user-based forum style where you can go and ask questions and you can get answers from that. But yes, it's always good if you have a critical solution and it depends on a project, you should have some sort of governance seat or better control or better discussion with them so that there is a close relationship, because in case they pull the plug, your solution is at risk. So those are important considerations. And if you're adopting a solution, how are you engaging with that? And that's why funding open source, helping them sustain is a good way as well. Hiring someone to contribute and work with the open source project upstream is a great way of doing those. So you have also better insight into the roadmap of the project.
That makes perfect sense. And it's great to hear of a community is working and flourishing and supporting.
And your questions about the internal expertise on like open source. So I have seen amazing people from ICTDs who have deep understanding of how technology works or how to deploy it, how to host it, how to do the risk mitigation strategy and auditing of the source code. I have not seen a lot of open source champions, and it can be in terms of, obviously we have David here, and there's a whole open source united community of practice that David will be talking about. So there are a lot of people interested in open source, but often because of different steps on who is supposed to do what, it's often not outspoken, and there's not, it's in the process of building it, but there is not a standard adopted policy, or there are open source experts in each and every UN agencies. I have not seen that personally. But there are people who know open source, who do open source a lot, and they're always supportive of it. But when it comes to legal licensing pieces, how to engage with community, we can do better in that.
So initial foundations there, but we could do more. Jose, I'm going to give you the floor to ask your question yourself. You should be able to speak now. Jose Huwaidi.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, how are you? Hi, nice to meet you. I know you a little bit from before, but yeah, my question is this one is precisely in learning, for example, sometimes there have been like tools available, like for example, today there is H5P, and I know it's been acquired by a company, but before in the past there was Adapt, or we know that Moodle exists. All this is free, like it's being sold as something free that we could use and all these things, but in reality we need to hire partner companies in order to implement these solutions. And what I have observed after like years is that for one reason or another, some companies, well, they kind of like take ownership of the project. So you become dependent on them. There are customizations, the costs increase, these kind of things. Or for example, with Adapt, maybe somebody has created learning materials in the past with Adapt using a plugin. That plugin was abandoned by the developers, and then 5 years later, you want to open it, and you cannot. So you need to invest in recreating these materials with a different tool. And sometimes, in some occasions, you end up using commercial solutions because somehow they seem to be more sustainable. So I just wanted to know, what are your thoughts about this? And also, if there is something like an error or something during the process of implementation that can be tweaked or fixed in order to avoid these things?
Yeah, great question. And this is, again, I'll highlight back adopting a puppy kind of scenario. And as you mentioned, that you may need to end up hiring someone to run it and maintain it. But and again, I'm going to reference a study because I have like personal thoughts and they may not be, those anecdotes may not be correct. Study generally says that there's a significant cost reduction when you adopt open source solution, because to develop that same solution, to hire a vendor, you often end up paying a vendor every month just to maintain it, even if there's no significant changes done. And that cost adds up a lot. And if there is a way to, if you're worried about in future, that's where participating in it or building community around it, because community can act as a long-term sustainability ideas as well. And not in I'm not talking financial term, because sustainability is an overloaded term. It can be in financial, it can be ecological, or it can be technological sustainability. There are open source solutions that have been around for 20 plus years, and they are sustained because there's community around it making changes or fixing bugs or fixing CVEs. So yes, you're very right. We need to have a risk mitigation and just general ideas that, okay, what happens if this solution changes its licenses or roadmap? But if it is open source, you can at the very least make a fork out of it and hire a vendor or hire internal capacity to continue with it. If it was a proprietary solution, I'm just going to name drop the biggest company that I can think of. Let's say Microsoft realizes that, okay, there's a tool that UNICEF is using or UN is using, and suddenly I don't want to support it anymore. And if it's not open source, you have to do the whole thing from scratch, or either have to kill your own solution as well. Here, at the very least, you have the flexibility of taking that source code, which is already publicly available, and have that internal understanding or external vendor to maintain it. Yes, the challenges may be there, but it happens in both proprietary and open source solution. And that's why the European Commission study is very powerful, that even with all of these things, there is a significant cost reduction in terms of ownership when you take a solution to yourself.
So did we answer your question? I assume so.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, it is true. It's taking into account both sides of the equation. It's important. Thank you.
Thanks, Jose. Which entity are you from, Jose?
UNICEF.
Colleague.
Yes, colleagues. Yes.
Great, welcome. I'll take one more from the chat, and then I'll come to you, Christine, for your question. From the chat, from the Q&A box, rather, we have: what is the break-even point between designing a system or buying a ready-made system and developing it to the office's needs?
Yeah, well, there are many different solutions out there, and I often think innovating on top instead of reinventing the wheel is better. But of course, we need. One of the questions I was asked by someone is, if I have to save a child and there is no open source solution, what do you want me to do? Of course, save the child's life. It's about strategy, having the strategy that, okay, this kind of solution may come up in the last moment when we realize that we need a solution to fix this. How do we go about long term? Because in the end, we want to be self-reliant in a way. If you are buying a solution in certain way, it can't really be used in certain countries if there is conflict with that country. There are a lot of stops and blockers, and you may have different kind of TORs working with the vendors, but it adds extra complexity. So if there is no solutions and you need immediate help or immediate support to utilize that solution, of course, go with the best route possible. Because in the end, all technologies are just meant to do good. We are not in the business of developing solutions or building solutions that we need to decide open source or not open source. All of it becomes a side thing when we want to do and make an impact somewhere. So if there is nothing option available, go with that. But if there is an open source solution, supporting, using, adopting it will also make the solutions long-term sustainable, allowing a lot more other agencies to use it. And in the end, it's building an ecosystem of more sustained digital public good. So break-even point, I would say open source should be by default, unless there is a major reason why you don't want to adopt it. But again, I am the open source innovation specialist, so I may be biased.
You are definitely biased, but you might have a good reason to be biased. So painful initially, but pays off in the long term, and it's worth digging into deeper. Christine, I've actually just decided to park your question until our next presentation because I wonder if David is going to speak to it. Vipul, I'm going to say thank you for now, give you a little break, and then we'll come back to another round of Q&A to which we'll welcome you back. So colleagues, if you have more questions for Vipul, please put them in the Q&A box. And with that, very happy to welcome Mario back to introduce David.
Thank you very much, Joanna and Vipul, for that great eye-opening first part on open source opportunities and implications. And now moving on, it is my pleasure to introduce our second speaker, David Manset. David is a senior project coordinator of the EC-funded OSEE project, which stands for Open Source Ecosystems Enablement of Public Services Innovation at ITU. And he will introduce open source developments, which ITU is presently leading, with a use case on open source AI, as well as ongoing works at the UN to introduce a common policy framework on open source. David, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mario, for this introduction, and Joanna for this invitation to contribute to this webinar series on TechLearnTalk on open source. I'm glad to, as you said, introduce a few interesting initiatives in open source that ITU is presently leading. So Vipul, in his very nice talk, introduced a number of qualities that open source do offer to public organizations, governments, and even public private sector. Sorry. So the thing is that as Vipul highlighted in his talk, indeed, open source become a key asset for governments and public organizations in their digital transformation, as it helps reducing costs, building digital sovereignty. It brings transparency amongst other qualities. But open source does not come without a number of considerations to be taken into account, as were raised in the few questions from the Q&A session. Indeed, open source implies new skills. It implies building capacity, developing teams that are maintaining, migrating, updating all of these open source based developments. So overall, there's a whole bunch of risks and measures to take when embracing open source. So, having said that, I would like to talk about a few initiatives that ITU is presently coordinating that are helping member states and public administrations in their open source developments. One is, as Mario introduced, the Open Source Ecosystem Enabler, OSI in short, for which you have a QR code if you want to look for more information on screen. OSI is a first of its kind project that actually witnesses collaboration between ITU and UNDP, two of the UN agencies, and which is receiving funding from the European Commission. The interesting part about OSI is that it's actually a long-term project. It's a 42 months action, which started in September last year, which aims to go global and support 2 pilot countries in their open source development of digital public goods and digital public services at large. And to do so, our objective is to enhance their capacity by synergizing the local ecosystem, open source ecosystem. In saying so, what I mean is that we are presently developing a full education and training framework to accompany these countries that we will deliver as part of an open source program office that will be deployed in the 2 pilot countries. And the open source program office, which is an interesting notion that actually is really trendy today because this is a central focal point for open source development where an organization or a country can find support in actual experts on open source. And so we'll deploy 2 national open source program offices into which we will deliver a full training program. And this will then produce some knowledge that we will try and turn into an institutional and systematic program that we can offer to other member states. So the project has been going on for 11 months, and we've opened a call actually a couple of months ago in May. That now is over, but we've received 24 applications from 21 countries that are listed on screen. These are the yellow ones, so mainly the Global South. And we are presently into the selection process to define which will be the 2 pilot countries we will start deploying open source program offices in. Having said so, I can tell you already now, even though I cannot disclose the ongoing debate and potential result of our country selection process, I can say already now that given the success, we don't want to leave anyone behind. So we will create an affiliate program for the other countries to still have a chance to attend the training program. The only condition will be that they fund their own open source program office. So that initiative is, for me, very interesting in the sense that it actually addresses a compelling question that was raised in the former Q&A session, which is building capacity, building new skills to help and support countries in their open source and more specifically digital public goods and infrastructures developments. The second initiative I would like to talk about is actually the ITU Open Source Program Office itself. So the OSPO that we've set up for the ITU organization. It's actually a project that was partly funded by the Tides Foundation, and that started about a year ago. It's the focal point, the main place where ITU can find more resources and support in its own open source developments. And it's in particular to date taking care of a very interesting development that we've been exploring as part of a series of debates and consultations on open source artificial intelligence. So we've been teaming up with AI for Good for a number of months in exploring the compelling issues of embracing open source artificial intelligence in digital public services. We've gone through a special focus on education and have had a series of them, about 6 webinars, which led to the launch of a hackathon, because we, from the discussions, have understood that the state of the art is leading the open source community towards an interesting development in large language models, which, when combined with some specific types of learning techniques, can make it inexpensive and very interesting for low and middle income countries to get started with an open source that is not computationally demanding. So we decided to create a community around this hackathon development and to launch a dedicated track at the open source, at the AI for Good. So again, you have the QR code if you want to get more information. But what's interesting about this is that the outcome of our hackathon, which took place in April and May this year, was very interesting. First of all, it raised a lot of interest. We had more than 180 participants from 36 different countries, and 85% almost were from Africa. This led to actually 19 software contributions, which were precisely addressing the problem of fine-tuning these large language models to make them usable and customizable for the sake of a given country digital public service. So we've developed a use case, a simple use case whereby we'd like to provide off-the-shelf open source artificial intelligence, more specifically a generative artificial intelligence to support chatbots for public services, automated document processing, robot processing automation, and real-time analytics. And this, from this hackathon, what we've noticed is that we can use small embedding models. We can significantly improve the training of this AI with document pre-processing and chunking. And there was a few that used fine-tuned models. So there is a very interesting pathway there for countries dealing with scarce resources to get started with open source artificial intelligence. And so as one of the byproducts of this interesting exploratory hackathon, we've decided to create a working group, an international working group, to carry on the development of a reference implementation that we will deliver by the end of this year as an MVP in its version 1.0. We actually have a number of organizations already aboard that you can see on screen. And again, you have a QR code if you want to have a look more in greater details. So as part of this development, there is an interesting use case that is presently shaping up and that we're exploring with our partner GIZ and in collaboration with the GovStack project, which is the development for the Republic of Kenya of a multilingual AI chatbot for public services discovery. So the interest here is to deal with different languages and have those underrepresented languages used in the training process of this open source artificial intelligence to then develop a discovery service for the citizens to finally find more easily the services they are looking for and to access them. The last open source related initiative I would like to talk about, which I believe is really of interest, and especially in this series of webinars, is the Open Source United community of practice that Vipul mentioned in his talk. Indeed, since last November 2023, the UN organization, the UN system, started figuring out how much open source developments were ongoing throughout the various agencies and working on ways to improve, to harmonize, to facilitate all these developments from across the UN organization. So the community of practice has come up with the objective of developing 5 major assets to support the UN open source related developments. The first is to have a software catalog whereby we can reference all of these open source developments. The second is to develop a common policy framework that can be used to support all of the UN agencies to come to the same level and have a proper set of guidelines and policies in place to deal with open source developments. The third is to consider the various open source licensing schemes and eventually come up with a UN-specific one. The fourth is a code hosting platform, a source code repository that could be used by the UN agencies to facilitate their open source developments with a set of common security, quality, and code quality related process. And last but not least, again, addressing one of the points that was raised earlier on, a cross-organizational capacity building program to support the UN agencies in their open source skills upsets. So that is presently ongoing. We have 55 contributors thus far, and we have subgroups per each of these 5 items. Vipul and I are coordinating the common policy framework development. Again, you don't have here a QR code, but we can provide you with more information offline. And actually, you should hear more about this initiative in November this year. And with this, I'm done with this talk. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, David. Fantastic. And really happy to see that these efforts are in place at the UN. Definitely need and want more for that. And we have some questions coming in linked to that we'll get to just now. But the first one is one that came in very early on during your presentation, or potentially even earlier, and it links to capacities of developing country governments. So the colleague was not brave enough to put their name, so I'll read the anonymous question for them. It says, whereas the well-known open source solutions are foundational general purpose and therefore a lot of potential users and use cases, when working on programmatic interventions, we're working with tools for governments, which is a limited number and which have limited budgets and capacity for supporting the base code, base. Any thoughts on this challenge? I think this links very nicely to your points early on the challenge in supporting government. So what's your experience been there?
Yeah, that's really right. And well, the response we're trying to give right at this moment, and especially with the open source ecosystem enabler project, is actually to partially fund the open source related efforts for the country. So we actually, for the pilot countries, provide most of the funding to set up the open source program office, to hire the expert staff, and to help them basically building the foundations of their future open source developments. Post-project, which is going to be early on 2028, the governments will have to fund by themselves the follow-up activities of these open source program offices. And that is actually part of our strategy and discussions with the governments to make sure that the open source program offices will be sustainable. But indeed, as Vipul said, when you go to open source, it's not only a question of accessing for free software. You have to have a strategy, a roadmap. You have to take into account future updates, migrations. You also have to deal with potential deprecation of some of the open source software stacks that you're using. That's part of a typical, I would say, software development cycle. So I think that one of the interesting strategies to go with is to always have a core team, a minimal core team that has the knowledge about the whole system architecture, the products architecture, and that is able to cope with the roadmap updates, and not rely solely on external software vendors or expertise providers. Because otherwise you will at some point become dependent indeed. People, would you like to complement?
No, what you said is amazing. And I would say part of the presentation is not just to look at more or adopting more open source solution, but also some part of the portion of the budget should go on sustaining open source ecosystem on the solutions that you're using. It's not just about using it. And again, if there's something that does not exist, developing it and making it open source so it does exist for the next time when we are trying to work in a context where government doesn't have the capacity for it.
Wonderful, thank you.
Actually, I would add something to that. There are many new organizations who have been working on sustaining some of the critical component in open source ecosystem. One of that comes to mind, Sovereign Tech Fund actually, I think initially started as part of the German government relation to that, and now it's a whole unit in itself. And their main goal is to sustain and fund open source projects that are foundational to what we do today, but are often overlooked. Either they don't have enough funding or the maintainers are feeling burnout, they don't have the capacity to continue. And if they were to go, suddenly we would realize a lot of digital infrastructure is in problems. So many such places, I think one of the US agencies also did a $10 million call for participation for internet-focused solution. And there are a few more coming from different government spaces as well.
And Vipul, you mentioned the maintainers burnout in one of the questions that you answered in writing. I'd just quickly like to circle back to that. Can you explain what that is? What is an open source maintainer?
Open source maintainer, so if I have developed a solution that has gained large amount of adoption, open source when you develop something open source, you provide, which means you are the copyright holder or owner of the source code that you have written, but you provide with the open source license an explicit permission for someone to take it, use it, adopt it, and do all the freedoms part that we mentioned, the 4 freedoms, right? You are the main person who is still actively running it or maintaining the solution. So you are the maintainer. Over time, when the community grows, there may be different people who participate and help you in maintaining that source code. That's the group of maintainers. And often we talk about open source community and democratizing things, but in reality, if you think about it, it doesn't really work that way. There are a few people who decide or who come with their, could be meritocracy, or they show up, they do more work, and they have more rights and votes on what the roadmap of the project looks like. And then a lot of people use it and they contribute to different level of things. Almost in terms of elitism, if I may say that, and it's good that if you show up and you do more work, which means you have bigger say in the process of it. Those are maintainers. When a solution is very widely adopted, they often feel the need of continuing to run or maintain or do the security things, making sure there are no major vulnerabilities without getting the support and funding for their work. It leads to burnout because you are doing a lot of work without getting the recognition or payment and many different challenges that comes with it. You also feel extra responsibility that itself has a lot of mental pressure on you. And that's the burnout. When you have been doing something thanklessly for 10, 15, 20 years, it results into I don't care anymore. And if all the solution relies on this, let it be. And in that case, they just stop doing something. And that results into one of those challenges of I was using an open source solution, but it's not active anymore. And that's why part of throughout my project, I have tried to hint that it's a lot about sustaining and funding and working with the projects on how can we make sure that this ecosystem, that's why I like the word ecosystem more than just community. Because it's not everyone has one vote and we decide how it goes. It's an ecosystem. Someone is using it, someone is developing it, someone is trying to support, fund, and a lot of those things. So maintainer burnout is one of the biggest challenges of open source as we see now, because there are many people using it, many companies, governments using it, but not exactly giving back for the long-term sustainability of the solution.
Super interesting, thank you. And that seems to be a challenge for a lot of public goods, if digital or not, communities being one of them. Right, next question. I have this one for David again, and we had colleagues who were wondering what the progress towards implementing the recommendations on Open Source United were. For example, if you have started cataloging, and I'm gonna piggyback and invite Christian Wunderlich from DMSPC in probably New York to come in. Christian, you have a question linked to the repository. Would you like to take the floor and ask it yourself?
Yeah, thanks so much. So basically my question is towards, I mean, there's a lot of skepticism around open source, and I think some of it could be dispersed by having a little bit of a recommended repository, because I mean, for a lot of experts, there are certain open source projects we all know are alive and well, but sometimes we might look for something new and then we don't know, yeah? So are there efforts made to kind of do that, to find projects that are alive and kicking and where we know that security flaws that we find might be addressed, especially if we cannot do it ourselves. Thanks so much.
So shall I start, China?
Yes.
So, well, as far as identifying available open source stacks and having a central place for the UN related open source developments is concerned, we are indeed working on a software catalog. It's part of the 5 recommendations the community of practice is presently working on. So there is a dedicated subgroup that is in the process of evaluating software cataloging technologies to spawn a UN dedicated catalog that will be instructed by the various UN agencies. To do so, the community started last November. As I said, we've been meeting in April. And so we had a retreat meeting with all of the community coordinators for the subgroups. And we are having a monthly call with inspirational talks from outside, from external organizations that have gone through the same process. And so we've received presentations from a number. Actually, Vipul mentioned the Tech Fund from Germany. We also heard from CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research. And the European Commission that has gone through the Open Source Program Office setup exercise as well. And that is actually ahead of the competition, if I may say so, as they are already into the formation of a network of OSPOs. So we took really good advices and lessons learned from these various initiatives to get started quickly. And so by November this year, so actually in about 2 months, we intend to present a first version of this software catalog together with a software code hosting repository and the draft of the common policy framework that will be populated as well with the state-of-the-art analysis for the software licensing schemes and the capacity building program. So that is progressing quite fast, even though it is not that easy. And to make sure we are really to the point, we are presently still going through a survey that was circulated to all of the UN agencies and organizations to better understand their maturity in the open source process structuring. So we have a clearer view of what's going on, but it's still open, and I will be happy to share actually the survey URL in the chat. Maybe Vipul, you want to complement?
Yeah, no, you answered the question about the UN community of practice, but what I'll say is I'll answer the idea around how do we make sure that we are looking at the project and there is a good way to look at and vet at the project. I would guide you to this community called CHAOSS, CHAOSS, which is Community Health of Open Source Software, something around the lines, CHAOSS.community. And they are a metrics-focused community where you can use their tools to evaluate, look at number of bugs opened in past few days, or you can adjust. It's very well-made solutions where you can, there are also some models where you can see how the community interacts, how's the conversation going. There's DEI element of it, but also the bug fixes, pull request, release cadence, a lot of different things. And using that tool, there are 2 tools, Augur and Grimoire Lab. You can use those tools to have better understanding of the development lifecycle and activity of the project. I want to complement another question. When you, which was in the chat, when you say solution not active anymore, does that mean can't be used anymore? What I meant to say is not maintained actively. You can use it, but when something is not maintained actively, you are not going to get new bug fixes or not new CVE fixes. And that can be tricky when we are talking about, let's say, refugees data or immigrations and or period tracking application. If those are not actively maintained and the different governments may have different rules around it and how they are using, how that can be exploited. So it's very important to understand the maturity of a solution, and this metrics tool can help with those. I would also like to highlight recently there are a lot of work around supply chain of software, and also kind of empowered by European Commission's recently Cyber Resilience Act and Product Liability Directive. But even before that, SPDX and SBOMs have been around, and encouraging good practice of developing solution is very important for anything we do. And if we see that there's a critical solution that doesn't have that security component, highly encouraged to contribute back. It's not just about generating software bill of material, but what we do with it. There are many online databases that keep track of all new CVEs, and if you have it in your dependency, I know I'm getting a bit technical here, apologies for that, but if you have it in your dependencies, those bugs, you can easily get insight into that one of my components have this bug and will need it fixed. And often, and that's where when there are many different components, doesn't matter proprietary or open source, you are relying on a lot of open source solutions anyway. 97% software, all of the 97% of software, 97% of all software are open source. Even if you're building something, chances that you are using a lot of libraries, a lot of frameworks are open source. So having those strategies and good security policies in place will help you with that as well. So these two tools I would recommend.
Thank you, Vipul. I did not manage to catch the name despite you spelling it twice. If you could put that in the chat, that would be
Yes.
great. And then we can also include it in the email afterwards in case other colleagues were also struggling. I think we also mentioned Mario's question on a list of open source tools. So David, that's super exciting. November is not far away at all. Best of luck in those efforts. And if you have it ready, please feel free to come share back with us. We're very happy to help share with this group and beyond. I think we're going to leave it at this. We're slightly over time, and I want to be mindful that colleagues may need to rush on, and you might also need to be going. So I'm going to say thank you so much for joining us, for introducing us to open source. I've learned a lot. I always learn a lot in these TechLearnTalks. I hope colleagues as well. Appreciate you taking the time. And yes, again, join us next week if you'd like to dive a little bit deeper into open source and AI. We'll be sharing the recording and the slides. And can we share the contact details of you guys as well in case colleagues?
I did that in the chat. For any questions unanswered, it could be related to the community of practice. I saw questions on licensing or in general of the best practices. Happy to talk and answer.
Perfect. Wonderful. Thanks so much to all of you. Thanks to Mario for co-hosting, for ITU being a partner, to UNICEF for sharing your expertise. Wish you all a very good day and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you for
Thank you
having
very
me.
much.
Have a nice day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Have a nice day. Bye-bye.